along the way. Every year, as part of our partnership with Boston College in the States, we have a member of the Irish Studies related faculty come to visit us, and we sent some to speak to them. We had Ronit over in Boston College just a few weeks ago, and we have a postgraduate exchange as well, which will be happening over the next few weeks. It's a great pleasure to have from Boston College this year's visiting Irish Studies faculty exchange person, who is Professor Marcus Breen. Marcus is the associate professor, or is an associate professor in the communications department at Boston College. He is, as you'll rapidly discern once he starts speaking, not an American, but an Australian. He was educated at the University of Queensland, at the Australian National University, and at Victoria University in Melbourne. And he worked as a specialist reporter on the Australian music and film industries, and also directed cultural industries programs in Melbourne, and worked as a consultant on telecommunication policy, new media, and regulation in both Australia and subsequently internationally. He has taught in communication, media, and cultural studies programs at the University of Melbourne, at UNC Chapel Hill, at Northeastern University and Bond University, before joining Boston College, and is published widely in new media, in particular, with books including Uprising, The Internet's Unintended Consequences in 2011, and Rock Dogs, Politics and the Australian Music Industry in 1999. And he's the editor of the International Journal of Technology, Knowledge and Society. So Marcus's work has been moving increasingly towards facing Irish studies. So it's great to have him here as part of our Boston College exchange to talk today about his current research on the struggle for meaning in Irish cultural studies, kneecap and sinners. Marcus, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
I want to thank everybody for being here, and I especially want to thank the Queen's University in Belfast for the invitation to be here and for extending its warm hands to the Irish Studies program in Boston College. I'll just start my, hold on a minute, it's me. I'll try and start my timer and stop that. And I want to thank Peter for his collegiality and support. I want to thank Kathy Devlin, who I don't think is here, but for great and persistent organisational skills, which have seen me set up very comfortably at Tara Lodge down the road there. And I want to thank John Barry, who has already been on Zoom with my Irish Cultural Studies class at Boston College last year, and he's invited himself back, and he's going to be back on Zoom, but it's great to meet people face to face. I apologise for these, for these things. That's a bit better, I hope. I want to do a couple of things today, and that is fundamentally to take two texts that I want to locate within a fairly broad remit of cultural studies, which I've been in and around for many years. And I want to start with just two propositions, if you like, that will locate us better within the field of investigation, and that is to look at these two objects or artifacts, the Kneecap movie primarily, and then Sinners, the movie, and to recognise that in the traditions of Antonio Gramsci, they fundamentally are representations or expressions by organic intellectuals of the work that organic intellectuals do to not only take the experiences and the affect, if you like, and the politics of the environment in which they live, and then represent that on the screen, but also to expect that representation on the screen to have a larger life, an ongoing and, if you like, continuing life in political struggles. So these are not innocent texts by any means, and certainly the role of the organic intellectual is not an innocent role. The second point, perhaps I should have started with this, but the second point, of course, is that in cultural studies, and the kind of cultural studies that I'm doing today, is that of conjunctural analysis. What's the current conjunction? Where are we in history at this point in time? And of course, we're in a very, if I may say, a difficult and awkward time. And there's no way that one can make light of the situation of what's happening in the United States with an illiberal government and a particular set of occupations that are quite unnerving for many of us. But we will continue, and that is part of the conjunction which we live and work, in which I live and work. And of course, you'll know that the conjunctural analysis emerged primarily from British cultural studies, partly from the Birmingham School. It was taken up quite from Louis Althazair's work by Stuart Hall, and then really moved into a kind of location that is always and continues to be about how cultural studies contributes to an analysis of the contemporary conjuncture, of the contemporary situation and the struggles that take place. They are not fixed, and they are continually, those struggles are continually moving across various sectors of our interests. So they may be social, they may be political, they may be economic. Fundamentally, the conjunctural analysis tries, at least as I understand it, and as I will seek to do it, to engage with the broadest scope of interpretation, fundamentally political economy. Of course, the jokey little aside that is also associated with conjunctural analysis is we can also refer to that great critic of contemporary society, Marvin Gaye, who's saying, "What's going on?" And of course, that's what we want to do, right? We want to know what's going on. But it's not what is being only done to us, but then how do we respond to it with our analysis, and indeed with some kind of optimism. So with those two starting points, right, organic intellectuals and conjunctural analysis, I'll give you these AI generated slides. So I won't apologise for them. We're all basically colonised by these companies that produce this stuff. And I decided to go with. So how do we make meaning? Well, I'm going to look at, as I've already suggested and as publicity suggested, these two very helpful and, if you like, activist texts. They're not, as I suggested a minute ago, they're not innocent texts. They're not produced simply to produce entertainment for the global masses or for film scholars. But we take them and we, as scholars and as critics and as activists, use them to enrich our lives and the lives of the communities in which we live. So, as you can see, I'm going to firstly address NECAP, and then I'm going to address sinners. So this is in two parts. I also want to say that by way of introduction, that I'm going to be taking primarily an example from the NECAP film. And so I'm not going to be looking at NECAP in the broadest possible context, but obviously the context is important. But I'm going to be taking a particular song and a particular set of lyrics. And when you see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I apologise in advance if the language offends anybody. It seems to me to be important to understanding part of the disruptive nature of this kind of activist activity. Of course, one of the things we have to take in mind, or put into play, is the way that so much more culture is in circulation today. So I just want to draw attention to this notion of the expansionary nature of culture and the expansion of the political economy. that so much more is happening as a result of the media and communication material that's available to us. What's in circulation is dramatically different to what it was a few years ago, and it's immediate and it's on our phones, as we know, but it's also part of this mass circulation. And in a sense, what I want to point to is the idea that in an expanding culture, we have greater opportunities to engage with forms of representation that might not otherwise have been quite as commonplace. And so this kind of representation I'm going to take as something that Raymond Williams proposed, which is that the class and the interests in society that were previously speechless, that were previously reduced to silence pretty much by bourgeois organisation and by bourgeois communication, found with the expanding culture the opportunity to speak, the opportunity to have a voice. And that, of course, has always been the case, particularly in modernism and the story of modernism. And so the expansion of communication means that there are not only more representations available, but there are contests about what can and cannot be done, can and cannot be said. And just by way, parenthetically, of expressing how important this is, at least in understanding the broader conjuncture, if you think about the emergence of somebody like President Trump, you can see that you could interpret his rise as an expression of the interpretation of the expansion of culture, right? I did a book about this called Uprising, and the notion that what had previously been suppressed, what had previously been managed, what had previously been regulated was no longer regulated in any way like it had previously been after the 1996 Telecommunication Act. The internet was unregulated, free speech. Right? So you know the difference between watching something on free-to-air TV and what you can see on cable. Huge distinctions. So that level of contestation within society then percolated to the surface much more quickly, and Trump was able to mobilise those interests partly through his own social media platform, but also through making use of the many vehicles in that expanding media environment. And people who needed to be in his bubble were in that bubble. There's a lot of people, 77 million, voted for Mr. Trump. And they voted to contest the established norms of what they saw as liberal society. And they resisted what was there. So you can see this as a reversal of what we might have taken for granted as liberal progress in this situation. So that's theoretically, that's something I'm interested in. The other way to see this is simply as productive forces at work within capitalism, and that capitalism inevitably throws up more and more innovations, which, as the Chinese will tell you, are productive forces that can be used to create a form of socialism. Fully aware of the contradictions that are at play. I don't say this as if I'm some naive blow-in. I'm fully aware of what these challenges represent. So I'm very interested in political economy then, and how political economy and these expanding forces make possible what we see in some of the material today. And what happens? Well, of course, we also have global circulation of new ideas, not always good ideas. And as I've suggested, the large scale of these transformations means that culture has a new, and if you like, greater salience, but not a single unified salience, and certainly not a mass, a single unity as it might have had once, certainly before this expanding culture. So what's happened is that the large challenge for people in liberal democracies is to maintain the model of liberal democracy that they have. And frankly, it's probably a losing battle. And certainly it seems that way in the United States. So what this thing about NECAP there's 2 points I want to make. One is about NECAP and the notion of language. Language is very important in cultural studies. How do people and how do, if you like, suppressed minorities engage with language through this in this expanding environment? How do they get to speak? Well, of course, as you'll see, there's the standard notion of language, which is, well, NECAP was speaking in Irish, and most of the narrative that I've heard is, well, this is fantastic. We're getting to represent ourselves in a national language. And there are no concessions. It's very important to recognise that not being able to speak Irish means that I haven't got a clue what anybody's talking about. And so when the newly elected president of Ireland got up to give her speech in Dublin a few weeks ago, months ago, I had no idea what she was saying. Nor that anybody else didn't speak Irish, but you all did, right? You spoke Irish. This becomes a barrier to entry, if you like, but also a validation of national claims that are very important. And of course, if NECAP had done the entire film in Irish, well, it would have had a audience of a few 100,000, if that. So I've navigated these sort of 2 cultural spaces quite effectively. But it also, of course, foregrounded the questions that emerge out of colonisation and that refuse to go away, as you know. But of course, what NECAP was not to leave language as Irish language as a problem for people who didn't speak it, and also as a claim for a national identity. They also reused language in the way in which they used it in their communities or use it in their communities. And this, of course, was the language of hip hop and rap, which is a language that is not a conventional, respectable bourgeois language. And it is not a language that, generally speaking, a lot of white people pay attention to or know how to make use of. And in some ways, it's difficult to say this, but there's a point at which, in the black community in the United States, hip hop belongs to that community. And understanding how it is then appropriated into a different community involves some fairly difficult gymnastics, as does cultural appropriation at any level. The only point that I can make in favour of NECAP the band is that they were doing it as class allies of the black working class in the United States. And I wouldn't pay attention to them if that wasn't the case. And every successful white rapper makes a similar kind of claim. Eminem, for example, made the point about coming from a trailer park from basically nothing. And that narrative has been around for a long time. So that nationalist working class claim was, as I understand it, fundamental to what NECAP were about. But what they did then, of course, is to combine or articulate, as we say in cultural studies, a number of different concerns. And so they brought art, music, cinema as a form of resistance. And then they joined or articulated these three fields, right, of radical, national and working class culture and interest. I've simply suggested that combat literature is a useful analogue for thinking about what they sought to do and what they seek to do. Again, keeping fully in mind that combat literature is articulated here with the notion of organic intellectual. Right?
Can you expand on combat literature?
Yeah, sure. So Fanon's view was that the intellectuals in Algeria, the intellectuals who engaged in an anti-colonial war, had to engage in a form of, if you like, creativity and writing that would, in fact, take the struggle directly to the powers that be. Thanks for the question. the language of resistance then becomes, of course, something we should pay attention to. We pay attention to in cultural studies because it is very clearly a language that has intentionality. It's a very popular word these days for all sorts of reasons, but it's intended, right, to produce a social formation. Its intentionality is a particularity of a reaction from the audience that expresses an outcome, if you like. The question that I wanted to suggest is that the complexity of the formations is not always altogether clear with the band, and it's difficult to know whether the claims to nationalism, to, if you like, a united Ireland, are confused with the class claims and are confused with potentially any other claims. So there's always this ambiguity about how claims are made and what kind of combat literature or combat music emerges to find its audience and then to mobilise that audience. And that's the point I'm aiming at here, and to see what happens or what becomes of this. And in some ways, it's always an old question, isn't it? What happens to revolutionary intention? What happens to overthrowing the old regime if it's buried entirely in nationalism or questions of identity? And it may be that it's the most difficult question that this film projects, in that it might be simply a dead end. I would hope not. Okay. But what they did, and what I think is important to note, is that they also achieved something that we should not just discard because of that question and because of the challenge of that question. And what they did is to embody working class language and working class identity in their music and in their films. And of course, I'm talking about this song here. And you can see it on Bandcamp.
Your finger guns, your finger guns, your finger guns. Oh, 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 your finger guns, your finger guns, your finger guns. Get away from me. Your finger guns, your finger guns, your finger guns. Oh, oh, oh. Your finger guns, your finger guns, your finger guns. Get away from me.
I cannot tell you how nervous I am about playing that song. It's not exactly something you would play to your mother. At least I wouldn't play it to my mother. She'd disown me. So we understand the nature of the disruption here to language. We understand the nature of completely refusing, right, the respectable boundaries of communication. And what is particularly interesting about this is that within a fixed cinematic format where a film is being shown around the world, this film resonates in quite unusual ways, and ways I think that fulfill the intentionality of a language that is otherwise unacceptable. But it's acceptable within the working class. So I was brought up in a middle class family and we never used this sort of language. Mind you, we also way down there in Australia didn't know what the Fenians were. So ignorant on one hand and completely regulated, and Christian and Protestant on the other. So breaking those kinds of boundaries is where cultural studies says we have to understand what's going on here in the language. To go back to Marvin Gaye, right? What's the conjuncture? What's the point in history that brings about this incredible offensive claim? Now I'm talking about offensive to respectable society. I'm talking about offensive, but I'm also talking about an appropriation of language from the working class into popular circulation. What's this representation about? Well, in some ways, it's simply a representation of working class standards of speech and language. And it is generally not acceptable within society. What's important and what reinforces the claim that what we're talking about here is organic intellectuals is this, that the song takes on a life in the performativity and in the performances of Kneecap. That the music and the culture emerge from the working class. It takes on the form of, if you like, a formal cinematic representation, and then it lives beyond it. And think for a minute, how many movies do you know that do this? How many movies connect in that organic intellectual sense with not only its origin, an origin that's both politicized and deeply class orientated, meets hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and then continues and has an afterlife. For the activist end, if you like, of cultural studies, right, this is everything. This is what we're about, in the sense in which our research and academic work is not simply about the text as it exists as an entity without a continuation of a life outside of itself. It is not merely the object that we research and study. So that's what's interesting and important to me about this, and the second film as well, Sinners, as you will see. And of course, this is nothing more than a sing-along, a community sing-along. And one could ask, well, how is the meaning constructed in this for this audience? I would imagine for many people in this audience, the idea of being able to do publicly a sing-along to this tune would unleash a particular kind of orientation towards a new meaning, and that new meaning is a different kind of social formation. So this is where cultural studies is about cultural politics. It doesn't intend, as I've already said, it doesn't intend to simply be exploring an object of study. It doesn't intend merely to theorize that object of study. It intends that object to live and to live on in a truly meaningful and, if you like, resistive way. The other point, of course, it's very important to make, and I'm not going to talk too much more about it here, is the point of and the importance of youth culture and how youth culture takes these forms of resistance expressed in music, expressed in unconventional, disruptive language, and then uses that as a way of making a claim to not only to the performance space, but the social spaces. What social spaces might it claim to? Well, that remains to be seen. But I want to suggest that there is a significant rupture taking place, as you know much better than me, in Ireland, as to how young people see the world and how the older generation see the world. So 62% of 18 to 24-year-olds support Irish unity. That would be probably a debatable number, but it is a significant number if you look at the age profile in particular, what young people are interested in. Can we articulate the language of the film, the refusal to be respectable in their address, their life as organic intellectuals, bringing that into and through the generational shift that is inevitable in this country and in the land itself, to think about different ways of using language in political discourse. That's simply a question. I think it's a useful question to always ask of young people and of youth culture. I mentioned there this notion of the quality, and I wanted to make this point about the idea that there are certain standards that certainly in Ireland and everywhere really, but certainly in Ireland and I suppose we could say Anglo-Saxon culture, where the quality represents things that can and cannot be said. A particular way of life, a particular sense of respectability. And I've been reading a bit about this in the 18th century, and it was a particularly strong point of view about what people were worth, what people were worthy in the 18th century in this country. And of course, if you want to be worthy, as we know from contemporary society, you have to at least have something like a peerage. You have to be engaged in a particular set of class identifiers, wealth, status, privilege, and the rest be damned. And so the quality becomes a kind of marker that is less commonplace these days, I would hope, in countries like this, but it is very clear in the United States that there are very profound markers of class around quality. Now, of course, there's a huge struggle over quality, and I think it's important to talk about quality as one of these class markers, but it has other ideological considerations. For example, questions about quality in education are now under dispute, let's say at Harvard University, because quality is not expected to talk about Palestine, for example. Right. So quality is expected to be disciplined in a way that makes certain topics acceptable to people with great power who want to reproduce their power. So I want to mention that as a way of further refining the questions of class and why the class notions of language are important, and how culture can regularly, but not in my view regularly enough, be fractured by what's happening in the culture and through the material. So that's the end of part one, and I'll admit that it's not a comprehensive evaluation of kneecap, and I would not suggest that I want to do that. But I was reminded by John last night that, in fact, kneecap in the Irish language doesn't mean what might have happened to your physical knee, right? It means something to the effect of, I don't think so. And so at a purely resistive point, right, kneecap as it exists is the question of saying whatever you might have said. I don't think so. And frankly, it takes a lot of courage to adopt that position, particularly as a young person. But of course, this is where the great youth movements of the past have come from those people who said, I don't think so. The questions, as I said, which I would just quickly raise here is those questions that are on the board. Sorry, I didn't realize it was like that. Are on the board there, and that is, does the language that they use translate into organising of the people around them? I don't know. I have my doubts. Does it, or is it the progenitor of a new social order? Speaking politically, one would always hope so. An order that moves towards the final point there, which is an anti-capitalist and socialist order, which is clearly emerging. I mean, look what happened in the South, with the election of the president down there. And there is a very different orientation here, as I understand it, in Northern Ireland. And it's a matter of whether or not these kinds of transformations will be allowed to play out here. I'll go out on the limb and I'll say that I don't envy you being an extension of Britain, because Britain has no great interest in seeing a radical transformation of social relations or of the economy. And living in the United States, we know this painfully well, that those countries and those people who have been dedicated to a left project are currently under attack. So these things are not trivial. And that's what makes cultural studies somewhat uneasy about taking on these topics and accepting these concerns.
Two dinners.
I'm not gonna fall for that one. That was the best that AI could do. So really, I've been talking about cultural politics and cultural studies. And so what we see here is a very different film, not a Northern Irish / English film, but an American film made by an extremely successful filmmaker whose image appears there. Some of the AI wouldn't refuse simply to put the images up, but that is Ryan Coogler. And what I want to talk about here is a different orientation towards the Irish and a different orientation towards culture. But still recognising, again, those themes, right? Conjunctural analysis, what's happening at the present moment, if you like, if you're interested in Marxism, right? The historical materialist nature of where we're at, right? That's the conjuncture. History continues moving. What are the changes that are taking place right around us? How are those changes represented in those texts? And then, of course, the notion of organic intellectual. So Ryan Coogler has made a number of successful films, and Wakanda being, I suppose, the most notable. And he has a remarkable claim to be a successful filmmaker from within Hollywood, which is important. But Hollywood being Hollywood, and I suppose it's the nature of capitalism, only success is rewarded. And that is success in the marketplace. But I just want to make a quick point that it's fascinating that what Coogler's film achieved, and I'll describe it in a minute because I know a lot of people haven't seen it. What Coogler's film achieved has not been very much addressed by people who've talked about it or reviewed it or analysed it. So that you can see here, I'll just play this one from Frank Kermode, just to illustrate where a focus on music, for example, in my view, misrepresents. It starts with some scenes from the film.
Y'all ready to quit till y'all spank? You see my dancing with the devils. One day he's gonna follow you home. You got some problem. The hell going on? Oh, we on time of a party. This world already left you for dead. It saved you from your fate. You don't need no saving. Yes, you did. And you are? I am. Your way out.
It's a good trade, isn't it? So as I said, we didn't review it at the time because we'd been off for 2 weeks and it hadn't been screened before we left. So hybrid period drama or a thriller with a strong musical element, written and directed by Ryan Coogler, who made Football Station and Black Panther films. I think is the thing that's sort of probably the best known. So early 30s Mississippi Delta, identical twins, Michael Stack, both played by Michael B. Jordan, return to Clarksdale, which, as you and I have talked about before, I spent quite a lot of time in Clarksdale, home of the blues, home of the Riverside Motel, the place where Ike Turner was knocking together Rocket 88. Anyway, so they buy an old sawmill, which they turn into a blues-filled juke joint, and then their paths cross. This is all against the kind of the backdrop of old school Jim Crow racism. with Irish Nocturne Remick, played by Jack O'Connell, who arrives at the juke joint with two compatriots and asks to be invited in. Now, when people arrive asking to be invited in, that means one thing in particular. The film was tailor-made. I mean, because it's been out for a couple of weeks, I imagine that everybody pretty much knows everything about it, but I'm trying not to spoil anything.
Okay.
So look, tailor-made for me in terms of its thing, 30s Delta blues, Clarksdale, element of supernatural horror, resonating guitars everywhere, mouth organs, story told through dueling musical styles, and of course, this element of supernatural horror. So here's
Not to be unkind, but two white guys talk about a film made by a very well-respected and well-known African-American director. What do they talk about? Their celebration of black music as white people. That's great, terrific, nice. But it troubles me profoundly that the discussion of the film doesn't address what is the key theme in the film. And the key theme fundamentally is race politics. And I first realised that there was something going on in the meta-narrative of the film when I read a review in the New Yorker by Richard Brody, who's a very nice film, very good film reviewer, and did a nice book on Jean Le Godard. And he didn't mention the Irish once. Not one time. If you've seen the film, you say, well, what's wrong with this guy? So the film turns on the idea that Remick, as a vampire, appears almost out of nowhere, goes to the South, Jim Crow South, and then grabs a couple of dirt poor farmers without us really knowing what's going on, infects them as vampires. So fundamentally removes the life from them and makes them like him. They are white like him. In the meantime, two brothers, their names are Smokestack, returned from Chicago, having made their money robbing banks. So the great, yes.
What did you make of the scene of the Rocky Road to Dublin?
Well, it was a very dramatic scene. I wouldn't know. I think you're probably better versed in the meaning of that song than me. But certainly it was a very seductive. So Irish music then is used as a very seductive tool.
Yes.
Within the film. And what happens is that these two brothers, Smokestack, return, having made their money out of criminality, and they return to the South. And of course, the point for those of us who are interested in American capitalism, we know that most American capitalism is made through criminal activity. I think Ryan Coogler's being completely honest about this. And how else is a black person in 1930s United States going to get some money? Not to be at all racist. Right? Just like their white brothers and sisters up there in Chicago, like Al Capone, who's mentioned in the film, they do the same thing. So already got a deep critique of American capitalism. None of this is mentioned by either Brody or Kermode. So these subtexts are going on all the way through the film. The brothers buy an old shed and make a juke joint. And if you only watch the film for the first few minutes, you will get to the most spectacular African-American dance music scene probably in the history of cinema, in my view. I haven't seen all the films featuring this, but certainly a most beautiful scene of complete celebration of the emancipatory spirit of Black America that celebrates its capacity to own its future, its present, and to have a political economy that is its own. Yes, it might have been created out of criminal enterprises in Chicago and the money brought back, but the scene itself is a beautiful representation of Black promise. Well, of course, imagine the Black promise is not realised in this film. Well, what happens is that, of course, Black America comes into conflict with the Irish Americans, who are vampires. And what they do is, of course, what all vampires do is suck the life out of the African American community. And this is the haunting truth of the Black experience in the United States, that the life has been sucked out of the Black community by the white community. Indeed, by white supremacists. And so the frustration that I had with the reviews is simply that the reviews did not address the appalling state of race and the history of race relations in the United States. So the cultural politics was front and foremost, but it's so front and foremost that even Ryan Coogler in his interviews does not admit what the film is about. He won't talk about it. Nor will he talk about the Marxist foundations for the critique that's embedded within this film. He's very cautious, as many Americans are. I'm not American, so I'm not cautious. So this difficult narrative then is played out. And it is played out as Smoke and Stack act as successful entrepreneurs using their, we could sometimes say, ill-gotten gains. And what happens here is that we see a committed African-American filmmaker speaking from within his community. Now, if you don't know the code, that's fine. I'll tell you part of what it is. Ryan Coogler will tell you he's from Oakland. Yep, so what? Who knows anything about Oakland? It's the only city in the United States where the Black Panthers are still active. It's the only city in the United States that still has kitchens that feed the people of Oakland, the Black community. That's where he's from. So when I say he's an organic intellectual, I mean he's an organic intellectual in the sense in which he's connected with that sense of not only Black identitarianism, but Black power, Black liberation, and Black equality. And the quest for that as it's been played out in his life. And he's very clear about the origin of his, if you like, identity and his ideas.
Well, and sorry to interrupt again, but you know, being an American who grew up on the West Coast and the South, that's the West Coast. That is not where this takes place.
Mhm.
You know, Oakland is an industrialist area. That's where all the people moved out from. You know, during the Second World War. You know, during the war exactly to work in the factories, be deployed, and so there is this difference between a rural South and an urban Oakland, if you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. I don't agree with it because
Yeah,
I think the experience of the Black community is the experience of direct racism on a national basis.
It's different in both.
Fair.
parts.
Let's talk about that later.
Yes, exactly. So
The idea of the past haunting the present then mobilizes this film, right? To say, from Coogler's point of view, these were my people, not in the 30s, but my people seeking to create an effective, successful, emancipatory space in the dance hall. And they lost. And quickly, just to tell you quickly, what's haunting, of course, is that loss. And as the Irish vampire, the original one, infects everybody else and then infects many of the Black people in the dance hall and then starts killing them, what happens is that there are incredible scenes of destruction as the great achievement of these brothers, Smoke and Stack, is destroyed. Pretty much everybody is turned into a vampire. with a couple of exceptions. The sun rises, they all die, including everybody except Remick, who's waiting to be stabbed with the guitar neck, or what do you call it, the part of a guitar that the frets are on, and he is also killed. The Ku Klux Klan turns up to clean up the place. Smoke takes from a secret stash of machine guns, as you would, of course, I suppose, defending yourself during the Jim Crow days, and shoots down all the members of the Klan, every single one of them. Every white person in that movie is dead. Every blood-sucking vampire, ghoul, as a friend of mine referred to them, right? Because they're made up in a very ugly way. Ghoul, right, is destroyed. And so this is a sort of dialectical reading. One thing cannot meet its other without having to be transformed or destroyed. And the hope of black entrepreneurialism is completely annihilated. Sorry about this busy thing. So as you can see, the vampires are excluded, led by an Irish person, they're killed. So they're all killed. The Ku Klux Klan turned up, they're all killed. No whites survive. The Duke joint is finished. Black entrepreneurialism is over. The sole survivor is Slim, a young black blues player. He returns to the gospel church where his father was leading a church in hymns, to play the blues. And we're left with the blues. And as you can see, this is in my opinion, this is a form of Afro-pessimism. For a remarkably successful film, wouldn't you say it's a little bit disturbing that people who rush to see a vampire movie see the success of this film as being a great vampire movie, conveniently forgetting that the only people who survive it are a poor black kid who goes on to play the blues. And I offer you again Frantz Fanon, who didn't have a good thing to say about the blues. This partly informs my attitude towards those previous people, those white people who were talking about the film was a great representation of black music. There are some boundaries that I don't want to cross, frankly. There's absolutely no doubt that the blues represent, as Fanon said, a desperate yearning. And we should recognise it for what it is, a beautiful thing. But it also emerges out of what the film actually describes. The complete, abject, ongoing decimation of African American culture as existing in a free and emancipatory space in the United States. There's a long way to go, ladies and gentlemen. So this is cultural politics and cultural studies. This is the sort of thing that I'm interested in, that I think is useful. These topics are useful to explore. They're not closed by any means. All I want to do, if you like, with this presentation is to open the door to some ways of thinking about how cultural studies can help us to move into the territory that's contestable and that's going to be increasingly contested. As I said, because there's so much expansionary culture or so many expansionary tools that allow culture to be engaged with the community and with different fragments of the community. What this all means, I don't have a crystal ball and I wouldn't want to say. But all I will say is that, of course, the struggle continues. So I want to thank you for your attention and more than happy to take some questions.
Very much, Marcus. So we've got time for questions. We've got an audience online as well as in the room. So online people want to ask a question, just raise your hand digitally or type a question into the text box, and Becca will let us know that you're waiting just to ask what you want to ask. We'll start with the room. John, you put your hand up. So
A student that wants to. Who hasn't spoken already.
yeah. No, let's start with you, and I'll get a ball rolling here.
Thank you for that, Mark. It was really fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Although a bit tricky got the AI slot.
That's what it is.
The question I want to ask is something you perhaps missed out on, because it's all so obvious, that both in Kneecap and Sinners, there's a critique of settler colonialism, but not just capitalism. You know, it's really clear in Kneecap, get your Brits out and so on. But actually, one issue you didn't pick up on is the opening scene in Sinners, where it's First Nations people chasing the vampire. So there's in a way, there's a longer lineage in terms of American settler colonialism, but they disappeared then. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that. So it's a critique, both are critique of settler colonialism
Absolutely.
and not just of capitalism.
Absolutely. So I saw that and wondered what's going on. What happened to the Indians? Right? And it was a puzzle to me. Does anybody know? So I asked a student of mine who is Native American, and she said she loved the film. I said, "Well, do you know what that meant?" And she said, "No. No one knows." Okay. So it's about the relationship between the Choctaw and the Irish during the famine. So the Choctaw had been sort of helped in some way by the Irish in the past. I don't quite know the details of the story. The Choctaws in Oklahoma, around Oklahoma, then raised, and it's unclear how much, either $170 or $740, no one really knows, raised it from themselves, from their own community, and sent it to Ireland. Sorry, I forget the name of the town they sent it to help people who were struggling in the famine. So that's called a plot hole, in my view, and for film studies folks. It's introduced, it goes nowhere. But what it does, and I've written about this, not in this, but I've written about this as a way of setting up a utopian kind of field in which, in a multicultural America, everybody's participating. So the film is good with Chinese people, African American, white people, and the Choctaw or the Native Americans. So the reason that's there, the reason that is there is, if you, in my view, to establish a kind of utopian space in which people were prepared to care for each other. They weren't chasing the Irish vampire. They were seeking to identify him, and the theory may well be that they were seeking to help him, to give him something like they had in the past. But there's no closed reading on that, but it's a fascinating insight. And I was really shocked that my Native American student had no idea what was going on. So it's not well known, and it's I think probably be a fault in the filmmaking process not to have had some clue as to what this was about. I don't know how you do it. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Cultural studies and film studies suggest that films are different, but they're not result of one artistic vision, but of a team, of a crew, of sometimes tens, hundreds of people. I was just wondering, maybe there's just a verse about how you're thinking of that.
Fundamentally, a film has to rises and falls on an idea. And if it doesn't have an idea, it doesn't have a life. And so my view would be, yes, there are hundreds of people whose skills go into making a film. But from the point of view of the community from which the idea originates, and then is transferred to the screen, and then continues after its life on the screen, if you like, in a virtuous circle back into the community. And then from a political point of view, mobilizes the community to not only understand itself better, but to take that idea and then to create more consciousness about their conditions. Then that would seem to me to be how I would describe the organic intellectual. And as I said earlier, there are plenty of movies and plenty of cultural artifacts that exist merely as a an expression of artistic intent, and once they get through the machine, as a way of being commodified to make money. And they expect to go nowhere else. I mean, that's quite fanciful. Of course, they're all ideologically loaded and intended to reinforce particular claims and cases. But these two films, particularly seen in the context from which I'm from the United States, don't do that.
Yeah.
Very memory of this, but the end of the film, they turn up in a bar, the vampires, and meet the contemporary. And I was just wondering how you interpret that moment of, like, you know, continuity into the present and remembrance.
Right, that's true. It's an unusual point. My thought about that is that this is still the lonely blues player. He's not living with anything else but the success of his career as a blues musician. Again, you don't have to be quite such a pessimist to see it as just the end of really getting nowhere. But in a sense, if you read that image against the rest of the film, particularly that scene of Slim's father in the church, you see that this is a dead end. Now, in that sense, what I'm saying is that kind of the effectiveness of religion in disciplining, regulating, and suppressing emancipatory instincts within the Black community has been pretty profound. Now, there are plenty of Black brothers and sisters and comrades in the United States who probably want to hit me when they heard me say that. But the fact of the matter is that's often the case. That religion has been used and abused to suppress political organising. So it's a very sad image, but it's also kind of a sense of relief, isn't there, that he survived. Out of all those things, at least he survived. At least he's still alive. But on a broad reading, of course, he's just there sitting in the pub. What else could have been achieved in that life? If the juke joint had continued, that would have been a whole other stream of economic activity in that community. And of course, the Klan had to be killed, but they didn't want it, right? Nor did the vampires. Of course, the vampires and the Irish are connected, and I didn't make this point clearly enough, are connected to the history of white supremacy in the United States. And that's the point around which all the white people are killed, in a sense, in a very strong claim that Kugler makes, to say that once upon a time, we Irish, you Irish, and we Black people might have been similar, right, on a similar socioeconomic or cultural or ideological plane. We're inferior to the white settler class, to the Brahmins, as we say in Boston. You Irish joined the white supremacists. That's what you became. And the film was absolutely brutal in that sense.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Actually, I really enjoyed it. It's really cooperative and everything. And I haven't seen the film, but I came across I heard discussion of, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's a boxer from America called Terence Crawford. Oh wait, no, Terence Crawford. He's a black boxer from America, and he's the beat Canelo to win basically become the undisputed champion with his weight across. He kind of set in the debate where he was the best in the era. And he was on Joe Rogan's podcast recently,
Right.
and conversation between him and Joe Rogan about why it is that black boxers seem to be the ones who provide this kind of trash talk in the run to a fight. And Joe Rogan asked him this, and then he said, no, it doesn't, white boxers don't do it, or like that, this kind of conversation ensued. And Joe Rogan said to him, well, let Conor McGregor beat and toss rubbish. I don't know if there's fight. And Crawford said, well, McGregor's Irish, so he's one of us. And I just thought that was interesting and relatively made me think this we talked about this,
Right.
especially when you consider the kind of influential nature of McGregor and his essentially alt-right leaning. So in one sense, in what Terence Crawford seems to say is that because he's Irish and has this apparent veneer of authentic Irishness,
he leans into what an American might understand as that sense of blackness. But if you actually look at the politics which McGregor's had taken forward, it's more in that kind of Trumpian school, which and so there's kind of conflict there. So anyway, that's not necessarily directly related to what Trump would necessarily in your lecture, but it seemed to be a kind of popular understanding recently that touched on similar themes. So I just had heard about it. I've been interested in your perspective, or even if you haven't heard my description, it would be interesting to see if there's any comments or what these are anything learned from that. Compared to what the message of the film was.
Thanks. I appreciate your thought and the observation. It goes back in some ways to the kneecap language question and the appropriation of whatever's appropriate within the culture of, let's say, boxing or martial arts, mixed martial arts. But there is no sense, as I hear you saying, there's no sense in which that language transfers to any identification with the politics of blackness. Right? So it's a misappropriation. It's appropriation of anything that serves their purposes. McGregor's purpose is to claim a similarity with the black community, with the black working class, but he's more than happy to move out of it and become their political and ideological enemy as soon as he's not trash talking. This sort of thing happens all the time. There's sort of navigating across class boundaries and navigating across race boundaries. And certainly, I would imagine that most of the black folk that I know would be completely disgusted with this appropriation. It's why I mentioned, the challenges of whites doing hip hop, similar kinds of questions. They're not, and the categories are not fixed. So you can be a working class thug, an extremely well-paid working class thug doing mixed martial arts, using all the tropes of blackness that serve your purposes. And you can also be a rabid Trump, MAGA, right-winger, and a white supremacist. You live the contradiction, bro. John? Sorry.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
Diane Negra. In 2006. So
Right.
It's a while ago now.
Yeah, she's going to be at PC in a couple of weeks.
US, so there is that ability to kind of claim underdog identity and sort of insulate yourself from the face of racism while simultaneously participating in structured white supremacy. So if you're
What's the name of the author? Sorry?
Diane Negra.
Yeah.
Irish shape.
It is good. It is a good book. Yeah, it's a good book. Thank you. John?
Ross, thank you. I want to take on that question that you flagged up in the middle. Tensions between nationalism and class. Thinking about NECAP and the impact they've had, it's quite interesting that in a way their biggest political impact has not been within the North and politics here. It's been over the Palestinian issue, which works, of course, because of the colonial circumstances that exist in both places, and has allowed them to be active. And interestingly, some of the gigs that they've done, I'm interested in the gigs they've done in India, actually, because this is where the tension arises. They've done them in London with Paul Weller, and his early work with Jam used very British mod symbols, but turned them on their head in a sort of anti-colonialism, anti-war thing, which is his. And there I can see how the power of that cultural space. The tension comes, however, in the class bit of the politics, because when I watched them in the Leeds Festival, when NECAP are playing and they have this routine with the what do they call it? The front, we call it polo. The appropriation that the Americans did in the 1990s of the punk going in Britain, up and down, the mush pit, all that sort of thing. I'm going to make a claim on that from the late 70s and early 80s, all right? But the interesting thing is before the songs, they have to explain the Brit stuff. With their audience there, they can't just play it and do it. They need to try and overcome what appears to be to your audience there anti-British. I mean, I understand where they stand on the British state, but of course that doesn't come over in the same way in those contexts. I wonder what you think, because that's a good example of where the class stuff reaches a block because of the use of nationalism in that sort of thing and limits a sort of radicalness in that sphere. I just wonder what you think about that tension.
Well, I mean, you made the point yourself. I think the tension is inevitably likely to fall into more nationalism and not be a mobilizing energy for class solidarity. But on the other hand, there's always another hand. We're all academics. On the other hand, isn't it wonderful to see and to hear that they take the time to explain to their audience what they're doing, right? So there's political education taking place, right? So you can't deny that. So I don't think you should deny that, and you shouldn't, and we shouldn't deny the agency that they are claiming, and the opprobrium and the anger that's been directed towards them for their support for Palestine. I mean, they will not get a visa to visit the United States again. They would have made, I was saying to someone the other day, they would have made millions of dollars touring endlessly the next couple of years. But once they expressed support for Palestine, once they were anti-Zionist, the whole mechanism kicked in and they're out of it. There's not a lot of people who find that, who can locate themselves in that way. Certainly not white performers. I mean, I know a lot about Nina Simone, where she couldn't stand to live in the United States, lived in Paris most of her life, and tried to do her work there, and James Baldwin similarly. So there's a tradition within the black formation, but certainly this sort of contradictions that they have to face, and trying to do their best as, if you like, public intellectuals and educators. But that's pretty remarkable, frankly. And you can see where, outside of celebrity, you can see where the politics of performers is not simply a cynical exercise to gain an audience of liberals or leftists when they take on this sort of situation, when they take on these sorts of positions. I think it speaks volumes. We should pay attention to that, frankly.
Rebecca, any questions online?
It's celebrated as a working class language and as a type of class solidarity, but it's to be done with all the sexist aspects of that particular language because it's coming from the black language and it is a major part of the black language, I guess. Also, I don't know all of the lyrics, but also part of their music language too. So I was just, concerned with conceptualizing it as a working class language only because then it feels to me like that, is that working class language a sexist language? Because I don't think so. But yeah, I just want to hear your opinion about that.
That's a great question. I as I told you, I was very anxious about putting up that language. Working class language is sexist. It's misogynistic. I mean, why pretend otherwise?
Doesn't that homogenise the working class, and it's like
It does homogenise the working class.
there's no middle class culture, working class culture, cultures in
Yeah,
the
that's why I made the point about equality. There's a point at which people are known and educated and formed very much along class lines, not to use that kind of language, let's say in a public sense, or in a sense that might be maybe offensive. We all know that. We're all nice people. That's why I had to apologise for you for putting that slide up and playing that song, right? That's the nature of the beast. But generally speaking, I don't think there should be too much controversy about the fact that those people in our society who don't have the opportunities to engage in codes of taste, who don't have the cultural capital that we as bourgeois or middle class folk have, are suffering in a very different way to any suffering that we as middle class folk would have. And I'm just assuming that's all of us. And frankly, I think working class culture is often a very brutal culture. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's brutal. I'm saying it's rude. I'm saying it's misogynistic. I don't think, and that's been part of the problem with hip hop. That's why hip hop has been so heavily policed, because it is taking exactly the ideas of the social relations within working class black communities and making it public. Way back when Tipper Gore was doing the Parents Music Resource Centre, right, when Al Gore was vice president, that was probably before some of you were born. And that was all about regulating, policing, and stopping the circulation of black working class language, because it was misogynistic, and because it was violent, because it represented the communities in a particular way.
I just want to say, I wasn't trying to say that working class language is a sexist language. That's not more like, it's not about using a sexist language or not. It's not about being respectable or having that cultural capital. It's about patriarchy. Like everyone could be sexist. I don't think it's a plastic, but like, if that language, if Nick's language is presenting the experiences of the working class, if naming it as a working class language means that it presents working class experience, and where is like working class women experience?
Right.
So because these are like two young men,
Right.
two hetero men talking about their sexual relationships with women and drugs and what them to
Sure.
do. So that's what I was trying to get into.
That's fine. And I think your implicit criticism is absolutely right. I mean, where are the women saying the same things? Where are the women talking about their experiences, either sexual or just social?
CMAS.
Yeah. So they're much less public and much less supported, and that's been the case in the music industry and cultural productions generally. Did we get to somewhere near some sort of either?
I think we take different. I don't know. I think we take different positions on it, and I would sort of push back on this idea of like trying to sort of reify this idea of class and connected to music and whatnot. I'm an ethnomusicologist, by the way, from my sins. But when we talk about what we mean by working class culture, I would sort of agree with what Damla was sort of getting at, I think, there. And then I would also probably push you on this, on its opposite, if you like. So if you're saying that this is emblematic or exemplary of working class culture, what is middle class culture vis-a-vis music? There's a very different dimensions with politics of this in the north than there is in
Really?
the public.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
Right. Yeah. Right.
That's the same in Glasgow.
Yeah.
Also, again, when you decry these people as fenian cunts and whatnot, you're saying, well, actually, this is what we were called historically, and we're taking that back.
Exactly.
Just like this, the N1, for example, we can say this type of thing. So for me, it was more the Fenian element that I would go into in that song, rather
Right.
than the C-bomb that comes
Right,
after.
right. No, those are important points, and I appreciate your comments. I appreciate the pushback, and it's important to have these sort of refine these questions and refine
Dialectics, you pointed out yourself.
and refine the categories that we're dealing with. They're not certainly not fixed. These categories of class are not fixed. I mean, think about it. Not in the north, but if you think about the career of U2, if you think about a song like Sunday Bloody Sunday early in their career,
This is not a rebel song.
and then how they went, and then how they became, thoroughly establishment. So there's also these transformations that people go through, becoming celebrities. Frankly, I think that what's going to save Kneecap is the fact that they're not going to be able to make millions of dollars touring the United States. They're going to have to stay back. What was a pub in which someone was in, and they were making a noise in the pub down there down the street here. They're going to have to stay local. They're going to have to stay real. So we should be thankful for that. if you're interested in those kinds of politics. Because, money will destroy the art, frankly, and that's in some ways what it intends to do. And it intends to buy people off and destroy the struggle. I'm very old fashioned in that sense. But, I live in the United States, so I've got an excuse for saying it.
Did what kneecap the stage commentary on Israel in the US, did it have any impact on what was going on campuses and so on? I mean, we know what the official response is. And I heard Sharon Osbourne, who I believe is might not have been Jewish background or whatever. So there's I know there's that kind of commentary, but was there any kind of different commentary?
It would have been very short-lived in terms of students who were involved in the Palestinian movement, pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist movement, would have found a great deal of comfort and solace in attending those kneecap gigs.
Are they that big? How much of an impact are they?
They weren't arena size. They weren't arena size, but my guess was that if they'd been able to continue touring, they would have got to probably pretty close to arena size. In other words, the ability.
Coachella, as I understand it, is Glastonbury in the US, is it?
Sorry.
Big Coachella is like.
Coachella, that's right.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, and the fees are very.
So that must presumably, like Glastonbury, what they said. I don't know if it's televised necessarily Glastonbury.
Yes, it is.
But that's quite.
Oh, it's streaming.
National
It's streaming. But it's not so much, whether it's public or so on. It's a bunch of Zionist clowns who then say, "Oh, we have to do something about this." Happens all the time. So it's very important. A few very influential people who are determined to stop a particular kind of public engagement, and public discourse in the United States. I'm active in a group called Jewish Voice for Peace. The struggle there is always about the capacity of the entire Jewish community to speak, not as one voice, but with many voices and with great diversity. And unfortunately, that's very, very hard because of that simple narrative. So it's not whether or not they're on TV, although we're getting a lot of publicity, but it was preempting the fact that they might actually gain traction in being able to make a very strong set of statements in support of.
Is there any other artists that would do that in the US?
Yeah, Matt Moore, that's a good question, but because what they can do with what the US can do is it claims it privileges US citizenship. So because I'm a US citizen, I can say the things I would say here. If it was a green card holder or permanent resident, I wouldn't give this talk. Right? I wouldn't say. So there were different levels of citizenship and different qualities of human beings now, apparently. Right. So I hope the immigration lets me back. If I'm not, I'll be camping in Peters. I'll be camping in Peters. Associated with it. And that's part of the course, I'm afraid, in terms of what the state will allow. And then in a free society, perhaps what happens outside of what the state will allow, which is what we see in just seeing here, these are films that are produced without government money. They're capable, and certainly not government money in the United States. It's one area of social life that we should celebrate, because it does at least, where there's a political commitment on the part of those producers and filmmakers to engaging with these political ideas, then they can do that without the constraints of the government or tastemakers who don't like them. That's.
Thank you all very much for coming.
But one other question, sorry.
Yeah, sorry,
I'm just talking about the filmmakers. I started watching these films as a kid, and I think I was watching. Okay. John Sayles. And the kind of music and time or kind of what you're together and very political tension. So films like Lone Star.
Yeah, we did a film about the trade union movement.
Working together and so on. Quite optimistic. Historical kind of elder. Also, construct. Do you think in Sinners that the only reason to kill all the white zombie movie that there would be much more
That's a very
left.
You're a film,
Being real, so
you're a film person together. So what happens is, of course, the genre of vampire movies makes it possible, without any questions being raised, to have that conclusion. Right? To kill all the white people and pretend, well, not really pretend that's misspeaking, but to say, well, it's just a vampire movie, it's a bad people. But if you see it through, as I've suggested, as you see this through the lens of race relations in the United States, and if you see it as in the sense in which conjunctural analysis takes place, that is from the point of view in which African Americans suffer in the United States at the present moment and have continued to suffer, right? Then it's not simply a zombie movie, just like it's not simply a movie about music, right? It's in very clear intention. That's the nature of the cultural studies that I'm interested in. Thank you very much.
thank you for that.
Okay, folks. For those of you interested in our study, we're taking a bit of a break now. We've nothing for the next 4 weeks. I think 13th of April will be our next seminar. I will distribute information about that in good time.